Today, we are going to be comparing the David Barron Dovetail Guide and the Jonathan Katz-Moses Dovetail Guide. Welcome to Tool Duel. So dovetail guides are becoming increasingly popular in woodworking nowadays because they make dovetailing so much easier for beginners. You can just get started and voila, you have a dovetail that would have taken me, 3-4 years to learn how to do. With one of these, you can do it in your first attempt, which is quite annoying really. So without much further ado, let's get into comparing these. So the guide we have on the left here is the David Barron Dovetail Guide, and this is made of solid aluminium and it has one massive magnet on either side and also has this protective plastic filming over the side to stop you from scraping up against the side of the aluminium. The Katz-Moses Dovetail Guide here is made from solid urethane and it's poured into a casting mould, so this stem here isn't joined to the top. It's all one massive block of just pure solidness. This is actually the same material they make pool balls from, so if you've ever been messing around on a pool table and you accidentally pinch your fingers between two of the balls on there, you'd know how much that hurts and you'd know how hard they are. That's what this is made from. So that's one thing worth knowing. There's no weak joint around here because that was something I first observed about this. It is all one solid cast. Now the first difference you might see with this guide is that on either side there are two magnets as opposed to the one magnet you have on the David Barron here. Now in terms of grip strength, the two small magnets give pretty much exactly the same holding power as the one large magnet here on the David Barron guide. The difference is with having the two magnets is that it actually gives you better location over the length of the saw, because with these dovetail guides, they are very good at guiding you through the cut. You do still need to put effort into cutting straight with your saw because it can still tilt on these if you're not concentrating enough, but having the two magnets on there reduces that possibility of the saw wandering as opposed to the one magnet on here that it's able to pivot on. And this is something that I have observed with the David Barron guide. As many of you know, I work in Axminster Tools and Machinery in Basingstoke. I've had a few people come into store and say that the saw is still wandering against the edge of this guide, and when I've gone to see them test out a saw, for example, I can see that their elbow isn't in the right place, their wrist isn't in the right place. They're not really putting as much concentration into the sawing as they should be. If you do want to know more about sawing, I do have a video on how to saw correctly up here. But anyway, that's a point worth noting about dovetail guides. You can't rely on them for everything. You do still need to have some sort of good technique with sawing. Now, an interesting point about both of these guides is that when they first came out, they were both made of wood. David Barron released the first version of his a few years ago, which I think was made of rosewood, and they became so popular that I think he just couldn't afford to keep making them himself. So they are now made of aluminium, which is obviously a longer lasting material as well. Wood is able to move, so the accuracy of the jig may be affected over time. Exactly the same story with Jonathan Katz-Moses with these. They were originally made out of wood, but obviously wood is able to deteriorate over time, so it's not really a lifetime tool. Whereas when you upgrade to something like this with the solid urethane, that is going to last many lifetimes. Now looking further into the materials of these, obviously you can see straight through the Katz-Moses Dovetail Guide, which is really handy because you can still see the areas where you've marked the waste on there. It's very easy for beginners to cut the wrong side of the line and thus get a massive gap in their joints, so being able to look through the guide and constantly have that visual reminder of your waste is a really good feature of this. The only downside that I have seen to this being clear is that it is a nightmare to try and film and photograph. My God, I tried to take some Instagram photos of this the other day, getting the logo in it, and you just can't do it. Absolute nightmare, but that's a personal issue of mine, don't worry. Now another difference with these, if you flip them over, you might be able to see that on the David Barron one here, there is some sandpaper that has been stuck to the underside of it. So when that is on the end of timber, it's much less likely to slip side to side. Whereas the Katz-Moses one here, the solid urethane here makes it a little bit more slippery than the sandpaper obviously, but to remedy that you could stick sandpaper to the stem, for example. If you stick it to the underside here, just be aware that you're not going to be able to look through the top of the jig and see your waistlines. Unless you get some of the see-through 3M paper, then it will be somewhat translucent. I would advise sticking it to the stem instead on all four faces. Now, let's see these jigs in use, shall we? So with these guides, it's worth saying that you can use these with both Japanese saws and standard Western style push saws. However, they both usually work better with Japanese saws. If you're a beginner starting off with woodworking, you will absolutely love Japanese saws. So to use these jigs, we'll start with the David Barron. Goes on the edge like that, saw snaps up against the side of that magnet, and you see now that I am able to still tilt that saw a little bit, so I have to put a little bit of effort into keeping it square. All you've got to do is keep an eye on the shadow gap along here and just make sure that it's even, and then just start dragging back. And there we go. So now we have a perfect dovetail angle, and more importantly, this is what dovetail guides will do. They'll give you a square cut along the top here, because the squareness of that cut is more important than the angle of the dovetail here. And obviously to do the other side, just pick it up with your opposite hand, rest it on the edge like that, and just drag back again. voila, there you go. So as you can see, this guide is pretty self-explanatory to use. You've got a dovetail shape on there, you can see which way you're cutting, happy days. The Katz-Moses guide, we've got writing on the top here which says what part of the dovetail you'll be cutting. So on the side here, I can see it says tails. So I can simply hook that on the back and start cutting. So again, nice square cut along the top. Then to do the other side, simply flip the guide around, saw up against the edge and start cutting. Again, I can check the shadow gap along the top here to see if it's cutting evenly. The fact that this guide doesn't have any plastic separating the magnet from the saw means that the saw is butted up right up against the side of the jig rather than being offset like it is on the David Barron one. Again, this is really good at keeping the saw tracking in a straight line. Another nice dovetail joint, consistent angle down the front and a nice square cut along the end grain most importantly. So now I'll show you these jigs in use with the standard push saw. So again, guide on there, saw snaps up against the side and you can start cutting. Now what you might see here with this is that the spine of the saw is going to hit the top of the guide. There you go, so it's bottomed out. Now I can't get any further, so I have to take the guide away and I have to finish that off by hand. Now because we're pushing with the Katz-Moses guide, it might be tempting to put it on this side so that you're pushing the stem into the wood. However, if you do that, the back of the saw or the handle will start hitting the front of this guide. So usually best to keep it on the back edge and then just cut as normal. Now because of the thinner profile on the top of this, it means that you can get a little bit further with a Western style saw. But if you're doing particularly deep dovetails, you will still have to finish it off by hand. Now here is a feature that the Katz-Moses guide has that the David Barron one does not. And that is that on the top of one of these faces, on here it says shoulders 90 degrees. So after you've cut your dovetails down the front here, you can pop that on the edge and you have a 90-degree dovetail guide. So perhaps you could do some sort of V-groove on the side here, pop your saw into the V-groove, get the guide up to it and then saw down into that, and you wouldn't have to do any chiseling on this outside line because this is incredibly difficult to cut with a chisel. Having a 90-degree guide like this that you can slide your saw into and just go straight down will make that process much easier. Now expanding on from that previous point, what you could also do here, if you're not confident about cutting to that line still, just get the guide, line it up with your shoulder line, lightly cramp it in place along the stem, and then because we've got a magnet on here, you can simply pop your chisel up against that and just tap it through like that. We have perfectly square edge on there now. That is a brilliant feature of this guide. So dovetail guides are not only good at cutting the tail section on your dovetails, but if you flip them over, you can also use them to cut the pin side. And again, this is an absolute brilliant feature of a dovetail guide because doing it freehand, being able to follow a knife line takes a lot of skill and practice. Having a guide like this, where in this case you've already cut a 1:6 ratio, you can flip it round and you're able to cut the pin sections. And the great thing about this is that it's not only matching your angle, but it is cutting perfectly plumb as well. Cutting this line vertically is as important as cutting the end grain on the tails here square, because if this end grain is wedge shaped or that line there is wedge shaped, as this goes together, it's going to split that joint apart. So as you can see, that's how the David Barron one works. You work on this side and you work on this side, and you're able to do both sides of the tails. With the Katz-Moses one, we've used 2 of the 4 sides so far. So this one is the tail side because it's got a slope on it, and this side is the 90-degree side. That means these other 2 are for the pins. So you see this magically locks in at different angles because the stem on this is a dovetail shape. So there you go, I'll lock that in the opposite way, saw up against the side and just cut through. Now, as I said earlier, this is where the Katz-Moses one can slip side to side a little bit easier than the David Barron one. But if you hold it securely with your fingers on the stem here and your thumb pressing down on the top, there's no reason why that should move side to side. If it does move side to side, like I said, a little bit of sandpaper on the inside of this stem here, that will stop it from shifting. So there we go, guys. That is the difference between the 2 dovetail guides. Now, as you know, I don't use them. I've had enough practice to not need any of these in my work, but for a beginner who is starting dovetailing from scratch and wants something that's going to be able to do everything from cutting the tails to the pins to even the shoulder lines, the Katz-Moses guide will do that for you. Incredibly easy to use, incredibly intuitive. You've got everything labeled on the top here to make sure you are actually using the right face. The only thing I would suggest, obviously, is sticking a little bit of sandpaper on the stem there just to prevent that side-to-side movement. That is pretty much the only downside of this guide, other than the fact it's a nightmare to take a picture of. The David Barron guide, still absolutely brilliant. People are getting amazing results from this. The only negatives to this being you've only got 1 magnet on there, so the saw hasn't got as much location. It's not quite as versatile as the Katz-Moses guide here, which has the shoulder section on it. And also this one is a little bit more expensive than the Katz-Moses guide, so you're paying less for more versatility. Hence why I would say for beginners, this is the one to go for. So if you're interested in either of these guides, be sure to check the description because I've got links going to both of their stores. And if you want to see the Katz-Moses guide in use rather than me just hacking apart a little bit of material, a video I did recently on how to cut a dovetail joint, link up here, will show you how I use this to cut the tails and the pins and got brilliant results from it. So have a look at that. Obviously chuck any questions below. Using a guide is not cheating when it comes to hand cut dovetails. It's just a more efficient and safer means of getting the job done. So see you in the next video.